Let's talk about how to find, hire, and work with a professional editor, as well as exactly when you need to do this step as a self-published author. Before I even get into it though, I think it's really important, just in case anybody watching doesn't know, that in the publishing industry, there's typically considered to be 3 different kinds of editors, sometimes 4 depending on who you ask. So the first one is developmental editors. They will typically help you with the foundation of the story, the characters, just the really big overarching plot type stuff, and they don't usually get very nitty-gritty and do grammatical stuff or line-by-line edits, although you never know, it depends on the editor. The second kind, and the one that's sometimes split up into 2 different kinds, is the line editor or copy editor. Sometimes they're called both, sometimes they'll split it up. It really depends on the person, which is why this is kind of a big gray area in publishing. But line editors are exactly what they sound like. They go line by line. Typically this is much more detailed, comprehensive. They're helping you with your style a lot, which I love, and they're helping you to catch inconsistencies, things that are unclear, that kind of stuff. So this is like what you most often think of when you think of a book editor, and my personal favorite. And sometimes, like I said, they're blended together, and so a line editor will also do copy edits, but copy edits can also be their own separate thing depending on which editor you talk to, and it can mean the more grammatical side of things where they're really looking at the copy. Depending on the editor, it can almost be more of like a proofread and really close to that. And that's the third type of editor you might consider hiring, which is a professional proofreader. So the reason that you need to know the difference between all of these 3 is that some authors will hire all 3 and they want everything. And then other authors might just hire 1 or 2 of them and try to get some free eyes on the story, such as beta readers or critique partners, to take care of the other things. And then other authors, typically ones that are more seasoned and have been doing this a while and had time to build up a network of other author friends, might even not hire anybody if they have friends in their space who have editing skill sets and they can do swaps with those people, such as critique partners or beta readers, for example. Personally, I think that 99.9% of authors really need a professional editor when starting out, even if you literally went to school to become an editor, which is what I did. I still can tell you from personal experience, I desperately needed to learn from a professional what it looked like to edit a book specifically. There's a lot of things that are book specific that you just won't know. So I have hired and worked with multiple editors at this point on the 15+ books that I've written here. Some of them have been great experiences, some of them not so much. And I have a lot of advice to share that I've just been nervous to share, because some of this is very opinion based, and I just want you to know that if you don't agree, that's fine. But I'm just gonna share my experience and try to give you a well-rounded picture of what this looks like. I also want to touch on pricing before we get into finding, hiring, and working with an editor, because that deserves a bit of attention too, considering how expensive editors can be. Developmental especially, but also copy and line edits very often are over $1,000, sometimes quite a bit more depending on who you decide to work with. And proofreading can also be a few $100s as well. A lot goes into this pricing. Sometimes editors just price themselves extremely high, and you just gotta be aware of that. Other editors might still be building their portfolio, so they'll give you a bit more of a deal. It really depends on the person, but it also depends on your book's word count, aka how long your book is, and what shape it's in, because editors will typically wanna see a sample, which we'll talk about, and get an idea of how much are we actually gonna have to do here, and then they might give you a price based on that. So what do you do if you're on a budget, like most of us are? One option you could choose to do is look at hiring a professional editor as a sort of college class or master class in how to edit a novel, because you learn so much from a good editor. It can honestly be worth paying somebody if they're really good and they're teaching you quite a bit. It can be worth the cost. Or you could consider just hiring some of these and then using beta readers or critique partners for other types of edits, which is what I did. For example, I'll just give you a little insight onto what I personally did. Instead of hiring a developmental editor, I actually took the time to go out and find beta readers, which, if you don't know, are literally just any readers who are willing to read a rough draft of the story and give you good feedback. And I was able to work with beta readers and kind of develop a relationship relationship with these people that they could tell me a lot of the same things that a developmental editor would. Like, this character makes no sense. Please work on this part of the story. It's very slow, but obviously a little bit nicer than that, hopefully. And I do have a video series about beta readers if you want to know more about that. So that's what I did after the second or third draft of my book. And then towards the very, very end, when you need a proofreader to kind of just do that final proof check, I actually have a lot of skill sets in that myself, being that I did go to school for that. And I have some people in my life who are also very detail oriented and know what to look for. So I once again was able to ask for help and then do that myself. The edit that I couldn't do was the one kind of in the middle. It usually comes after you've done as much editing as you possibly can think of yourself and you've worked with beta readers. It's the line/copy edit, and that one was the one where I felt like I really wanted to hire an editor, and I was very, very thankful every single time that I did, because I learned so much from them. And I did this for many, many years until I ended up working with an amazing critique partner who also had editing skills like I do and was able to do swaps with me so that we started to help each other out for free. All right, we got that out of the way. Let's talk about how to find an editor. Early on, I actually used Goodreads because they have a forum specifically for editors to share their, portfolios and let authors know that they're free to work with. I believe this is still a thing where editors will kind of put themselves out there, or authors can also put themselves out there and be like, hey, I'm looking for an editor. Is anybody interested? So that's one option. I've also known friends who use platforms like Fiverr, for example, and there are editors on places like that. The problem with these platforms, though, is that it's really, really hard to verify if they're actually a good and professional editor. That said, if you do go this route, I would definitely encourage you to verify as much as you possibly can. So you could look at their portfolio and say, okay, these are the authors they say they worked with. Let's actually look those books up on, Amazon or whatever. Look in the back if you can, or in the front if possible, and see if that editor is actually listed in the book. Try to read the first chapter excerpt if you can and look for any errors to see if it's really clean editing or if it has some issues. And if you feel comfortable, you could even reach out to that author and ask them, how was your experience working with this editor? I really want to know. I have also used platforms like Readsy.com. If you've ever heard of this, this is a much more professional website that does require background checks, and it does actually have contracts. So it has a lot of benefits, but those benefits make it more expensive. I have found that the editors on this website are like the most expensive I have ever seen. Some of them, honestly, more than I think is right. So just be aware of that and get, some comparison quotes from multiple people, and maybe off of Readsy as well, just to get a sense of what's standard at the time of you hiring somebody, because some of them price themselves twice as much as they should. Honestly. That said, though, I will be very upfront with you that this website led to one of the highest quality edits I ever received, probably because of the expense and also the fact that there is a required contract that kind of holds them to doing the best work that they can. In other words, you get what you pay for, honestly, and just keep that in mind when you're doing your research. Obviously, you could probably Google just like book editor as well. But if you want a more specific targeted way, the third way that I personally went about trying to find a quality book editor was actually by asking author friends. And a very similar way that you could do this, if you haven't built up a network of author friends yet, is to go and look at some of your favorite books on the shelf, open it up to typically the acknowledgements page is where an author will thank their editor, and you could find their name, kind of reverse engineer, Google them, see if they have a website, see what their prices and availability are, and see if they might be interested in working with you. But how do you choose and actually hire an editor once you've found a good kind of pool of potential editors that you might want to work with? I would highly encourage you to compare a few things, specifically their prices, their communication styles, and if you vibe with them, their timelines, aka their availability, like if they're a year out or if they're available next month, etc. And most importantly, their editing style, which you can learn about by asking for something called a sample edit. This is one of my favorite things, although it can be very nerve-wracking in the moment, but I also think it's one of the most important things you can ask an editor is for a sample edit. And this might look like the first chapter, the first 10 pages, or maybe 10 pages from the middle of the book. It really depends on the editor, but I think it's kind of a red flag if they're not willing to do a small sample edit, because this is pretty standard in the editing industry. And then after a set amount of time that they will communicate with you, they will edit your book, those pages, and return that to you as a sample edit to give you an idea of what their editing actually looks like. I cannot tell you who to pick because everybody's gonna vibe with different people, have different preferences, but I will tell you what I personally look for. And the first thing is, I guess you could boil it down to timeline/communication. How quickly were they able to complete the edit? Did they do it in the timeline that they said they would? Or did things come up? Because whatever they do with the sample edit is probably how they're going to be with the actual edit as well. So if things get frustrating there, that's kind of a red flag for me. Or were they completely on schedule or even ahead of schedule? That's awesome. I love to see that. The second thing that I like to look for is, how do I describe this? It's kind of like a Goldilocks thing. How much editing did they do? Was it too little, too much, or just right? Because I've had some editors who just literally fixed a couple commas, and if you're paying a hand and a foot, or what's it called? An arm and a leg, sorry. If you're paying an arm and a leg for edits, that's not enough. Like, sorry, no. And on the flip side, I've had editors who just completely rewrite me, and I'm like, that's changing my voice, my intentions for the story. That's not what I was trying to say at all. That bothers me as well. So the kind of just right balance for me is I like to see them putting a lot of thought and effort into it, because I know that that means they really care about my story and want to help me. But when they do things that are on the more subjective side, they don't just do it. They actually suggest it in a comment. And maybe most important of all, whenever they're making these changes, they explain why they made the change. The reason this is the most important thing to me personally is because that's how I can learn and apply what I've learned to future books. And it makes the cost of the edit so much more worth it if I understand more about how to write a quality book down the road. One other thing you could do that I've never done myself, but I find it hilarious, is to intentionally add errors to whatever sample that you're sending them to see if they catch them. I've never done this, but I always wanted to. Okay, so you've done your research, you've found an editor you like that fits your timeline, your price range, your editing needs. Now what do you do? Actually hiring and working with your editor is pretty straightforward, but there are two really big pieces of advice I want to share that I had to learn the hard way. The first is to get a contract in place. It doesn't have to be anything special. It could literally just be like something you kind of like Googled how to do a contract and wrote up something very basic that you both sign and date. But this could save you so much headaches, depending on the person, of course. Some editors are amazing and you would never need this, but others will surprise you. And it's better to just have a contract in place so that you both have something to refer back to if expectations are not being met. Obviously includes your names, but the other things that I would include would be like your expected timeline. What is the specific start date and specific end date that you both agreed to? Get that in writing. What is the exact price you both agreed to? Also get that in writing so that nobody is, adding on unexpected fees or something like that. Include the type of edits that they plan to complete, so developmental, copy edits, line edits, whatever the case may be. And a lot of good quality editors have begun to use contracts in the last few years in my experience, so you might find that they already have one, they send it over to you. That is an awesome sign of a good editor. Make sure you read through it very carefully before you sign it, but I think that's a really good sign typically. Oh, and my second piece of advice before we move on is I would recommend not paying in full up front. Like usually editors will have like a payment plan, maybe it's 2 or 3 or 4 throughout the process. Like usually there's a down payment to hold your spot and then there's a few more along the way. That's better than paying everything up front and getting ghosted. I've never had that happen to me, thank goodness, but I know 1 or 2 people who have experienced that. And I've also just had a bad experience where I ended the relationship before I finished my payments and I said, this is not working. like the edits are making the book worse, honestly, so let's just part ways. And that was really, really, really hard for me to do. That's not something I'd ever want to do if I could help it. And if you find 1 or 2 errors, that's normal. Editors are just human, just like us. Like, they're going to miss a couple things, which is why it's good to have multiple rounds of edits, multiple sets of eyes on your story besides your own. But if there are like hundreds of edits, or in my case, one time the person was actually adding errors to the book, then that is an okay time to stand up for yourself, because you should get what you're paying for. Last but not least, we need to talk about when do you hire an editor, because if they are a really good quality editor, they're going to be booked months in advance. I actually have a favorite editor who is booked over a year out very frequently. And so that's a good sign. That means they're really great at what they do. But it also means that if you want to get your book out on a certain timeline, you need to book them and probably put in a down payment way in advance. You might even hire them when you're still in the first draft, or maybe more likely in the second or third draft, for months and months down the road. But how do you figure out when your book's going to be ready to send to them? How do you know what date to ask them for? That can be really, really tricky if you've never done this process before. The good news is I actually have an entire free video all about how to figure out your book release timeline, including when to hire an editor and when to send them your book. I will link it below and you can watch it right after this, and it should help you get a much better feel for when you might be ready to actually send your book to an editor. Okay, that's like the big overarching view. I tried to think of everything I possibly could from my experiences working with editors, but just know that every editor is totally different. So always feel free talking to author friends just to be like, hey, is this normal? What was your experience? What do you think about this, you know? And then my other tip that I'll just end with is to really, really over communicate, because it's better to ask a bunch of questions and make sure you're on the same page than to hire somebody and discover that you're not actually getting what you thought you were down the road. That can be a very frustrating experience. So if this video was helpful to you, please give it a thumbs up, and thank you for subscribing and being here. I appreciate you so much, and I will talk to you again very soon. Bye.